الفاتحة بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا ونبينا أبي القاسم المصطفى محمد اللهم صل على وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين. For the love of our beloved Prophet and his beloved progeny, a second loud salawat. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa Muhammad wa ajil farajah. For the hastening in the return of our beloved 12th Imam, a third final loud salawat. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa Muhammad wa ajil farajah. So inshallah, in the time that we have tonight, I unfortunately have another commitment, so inshallah I'll try to summarize the topic that we were going to be discussing. This past Muharram, this Ashra, so a number of topics that I had the opportunity to discuss. Of them was one topic that after discussing the topic, multiple community members, multiple individuals in the community that I was visiting, reached out and shared that this is a big concern for them. And in many ways it connects actually with the times that we are going through. That is the idea and the concept of instilling Islamic culture in our households, in our families. You can see the very clear distinction between a person who might even be Muslim, by the way, who might even subscribe to the religion of Islam, a clear distinction in his culture when it comes to his concern as it relates to what's happening during these days and nights. There are, believe it or not, Muslims who subscribe to this faith. But what happens in the world does not necessarily concern them. It doesn't bother them. It's not anything that stays on their minds. They go about life as usual. Their 9 to 5 continues as usual. Their corporate life continues as usual. Kids go to school, they come. A lot of this is because there's a lack of Islamic culture within that household. If I'm following the culture of the prophets, it's not going to be so easy for me, as if nothing is happening around the world, for me to just carry on with my life. Neither is it going to be the case when Gaza is happening and has been happening now for close to a year now, and we are very close to another October 7th and the date of 2024. Nor is the case with all the bombings that have been happening in Lebanon and the incidents that have taken place in this past week. For reference, these incidents that have taken place and the killings that have taken place, for those who remember in 2006, when the war was happening, in those, I believe, 30 days or 3 weeks or something of that sort, it was much longer, of course, 500 people roughly lost their life. Here we are in 5 days, 6 days, and 700 something have lost their lives already. So there are people who live their lives and none of this bothers them. They just carry on with life as if there's not much going on, because the logic is, well, I'm living in a different part of the world. What does that have to do with me anyways? It's somewhere else on the other side of the world. This is not what Islamic culture teaches us. Therefore, for you and I who are living in this part of the world, it's very important, because our threat is not bombs. Our threat is not missiles. It's not these types of things. But it is a non-Islamic culture that is making its way and seeping into our households and into our families. And we see this with our younger generation. So if I want to walk in the footsteps of the Ahl Bayt, it is my responsibility to build that Islamic culture in my house. If it relates to myself in my own personal life, in my own way, but then also if I'm leading a family in that sense as well. So today, inshallah, I wanted to, of course this is a longer topic, but I'll summarize, inshallah. I wanted to touch on some of the things that helps us to build this Islamic culture. You will see that Muslims living in this part of the world, from time to time, you can see that that Islamic culture is lacking in their day-to-day life. You look at the message of the Ahl Bayt, they emphasize this culture a lot. So let us begin from the very beginning. If you look at the message of the Prophet and the Ahl Bayt, you find that what they brought for us was not just halal and haram. Halal and haram is an important part of our faith. But that's not everything that they brought for us. They also brought for us a number of practices, yes, a number of actions. That's not necessarily halal or haram. It's not wajib or haram. But they wanted it to be part of our culture. They wanted it to be a part of our lifestyle. So, take for example, the idea of coming to the masjid. Coming to the masjid is not wajib. There's no scholar that'll sit there and say, yes, coming to the masjid is wajib for you. It's not wajib. But the Prophet emphasized it so that it would become part of our culture, for example, yes? The idea of dhikr, remembering Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. All these adhkar that we have, all these a'mal that we have. The idea was not that you have to do every single one of them. The idea is that this would become part of your culture, part of your lifestyle. The idea and the concept of dua, all these du'as that we have, does it mean every single second I have to be praying to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? No, not necessarily. But the Prophet emphasized this so much so that from those hundreds of du'as that we have, some of them become part of my lifestyle. The concept of ziyarah, it's not necessarily wajib. It's part of the Islamic culture that I want to build in my household. And this list continues, yes? These were also part of the message that the Prophet brought for us. So the Prophet didn't just bring for us halal and haram. That was part of it. He also wanted to establish a culture that we would refer to as Islamic culture. And this is why for the Prophet and the Quran, certain icons had a lot of value, though there's not much halal and haram about them. But as a cultural icon, they became very important. Of those is Maqam Ibrahim, the footsteps of Ibrahim alayhi salam, where some narrations say when Ibrahim was building the Kaaba, some narrations say after he was done building the Kaaba, and he began to call people to come and perform Hajj. His footsteps sunk into the stone. Okay, so footsteps sinking into stone, it's not halal, it's not haram, it's not wajib, it's none of those things. But why is it mentioned twice in the verses of the Quran? Why did Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala emphasize it so much and say when you go there, وَاتَّخِذُوا مِن مَقَامِ إِبْرَاهِيمَ مُصَلَّى. When you go there, you pray there. Why? Because it's a cultural icon. This is the reason why. Al-Hajar al-Aswad, it's a black rock sitting in the corner of the Kaaba. It's not wajib or haram or so on and so forth. But Islam came and said, it's a cultural icon. It reminds you of a different world altogether. So Islam gave a lot of importance to this. Maybe the clearest indication of this idea of building Islamic culture, building Islamic identity, we saw with the Prophet and the change of Qibla. Yes? Why did the Prophet change the Qibla anyways? We don't know exactly when it took place and all the details. What we do know is at some point when the Prophet had left Mecca and he came to Medina, then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala revealed to him that the Qibla had now changed. It might be a little mind-boggling for us to remember that the Prophet actually prayed more towards Masjid al-Aqsa than he ever prayed towards the Kaaba. This is a little unusual for us because 13 years in Mecca he was praying towards al-Masjid al-Aqsa. Only after coming to Medina did he begin praying towards the Kaaba. Okay, and of course the change of direction is a major change of direction. Why did Islam prescribe this? Because it was a moment of building identity and culture for the Muslims. So the Quran says, Ya Rasulullah, we see you, قَدْ نَرَى تَقَلُّبَ وَجْهِكَ فِي السَّمَاءِ. We see you, Ya Rasulullah, you go out at night awaiting revelation. تَقَلُّبَ وَجْهِكَ فِي السَّمَاءِ is like you're looking up upon the heavens, waiting for revelation. Why is the Prophet caring so much about a change of Qibla? If it's you and I, we'll say it's just salat. You're going to pray in one direction anyways. But the reason why was because Islam wanted to give these Muslims their own identity, their own culture. So Quran said, no, we will now give you a Qibla. فَلَنُوَلِّيَنَّكَ قِبْلَةً تَرْضَاهَا. We will give you a Qibla, it will please you. Because this had become a problem for the Muslims of that time. So culture, identity is something that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has emphasized. And a lot of the teachings of the Ahl Bayt don't necessarily fall under halal, haram and wajib. Sometimes they fall under this culture that we have to build. Yes? Okay, wonderful. Now we live in this part of the world. Islamic culture is not what we're dealing with. We are dealing with a culture that quite often is non-Islamic, neutral, it's Western culture. And sometimes is anti-Islamic. These are the two options we typically have. So either the custom I'm looking at goes against my faith, or at times it doesn't go against my faith, but it's neutral, it's not Islamic either. So what is my approach supposed to be when it comes to engaging in these customs and these cultures so that I can build that Islamic culture in my household? When you want to come to this topic, there is a very simple way of addressing it, and then there is a more nuanced way of approaching it. The simple way of approaching it is looking at it in the short term. Meaning what? Meaning I take out my phone and I send a message to IABA-Austin's website. IABA-Austin, in the West they have this custom, they have this culture. Can I engage in this custom or this culture? Well, the simple answer that you will get from the Maraji is what? They'll tell you the custom and cultures predominantly halal unless they fall under two main categories. Category number one, if that custom and that culture is celebrated as part of another faith, yes, then you're not allowed to take part in that custom and that culture. It's something that belongs to another faith. It's an icon of another faith. You're not allowed. This is haram for you to engage in. Okay? Number two, if engaging in that custom and culture involves some other sins. So custom is to have parties, okay, so people are going to drink as part of it, they're going to mix as part of it. This is also haram. These are the two basic principles that your marja will tell you, yes? Why? Because when you send in the question to your marja's office, you're asking about a very particular scenario, engaging in this custom or in this culture in this particular time, yes? But there's another thing that the maraja also speak of, and that is this. They say engaging in customs and cultures where over a longer period of time will ruin the Islamic culture in my household. Will make it easier for my household to connect with non-Islamic culture than Islamic culture. They will say this is also a problem. If I'm building a household and the dominant culture is non-Islamic, such that when my child is growing up in this household, he doesn't feel connected to Islam. Yes, the maraji will say this is also a problem. They may not say, for example, engaging in this particular custom, this one time is haram. But they will tell you if you continue down this road, you are moving towards sin. You know what it's like? I give you an analogy, right? There's a time you might come to a doctor, ask a doctor, can I have a burger? Yeah, you can have a burger. It's not a problem. What about tomorrow? Can I have a burger tomorrow? Well, you can have a burger tomorrow too. What about the day after that? Okay, every day you ask him, he'll tell you, yeah, it's not going to be detrimental to your faith in that sense. But if you tell him, can I have a burger for 10 years? Then he's going to say, no, this is problematic. You are going to put yourself in a situation, your health is going to be compromised, yes? Similarly, the scholars have an issue with anything that ruins that Islamic culture within my household, yes? Therefore, when it comes to Western, and I just say Western because we live in the West, sometimes it might be Eastern. Either way, Western or Eastern, non-Islamic customs, practices, you can throw in holidays. When it comes to these things, brothers and sisters, there are two important principles we always have to keep in mind. Beyond the simple fiqh issue. The simple fiqh issue was what? Does it relate to another faith? Does it involve other sins? These are simple. I can pinpoint them right away. But no, Islam has two more teachings as it relates to these customs that we come across. If someone says, how do I build an Islamic culture in my household? This is how you do it. This is the roadmap to do it. Principle number one, the custom, culture, let's throw in holiday, Halloween is coming around, Christmas is coming up, all of these dates that come up. How often do you find Muslims have debates on these issues, yes? When Christmas comes around, one Muslim says, if you celebrate Christmas, you're the worst Muslim God ever created. The other one says, no, it's the birth of Jesus, it's not a problem, go all out in it. So which one is it? What is our Islamic culture teaching us in these situations? Principle number one that the Ahl Bayt taught us. Any custom I want to get myself involved in, even if it's not haram, I have to always look at what values is it pushing in my household. The values it's pushing. Not every non-religious custom or holiday or practice are the same. No, they can be very different from one another, depending on what type of values they are pushing. So, for example, Mother's Day is not the same as Valentine's Day. Very different values are being pushed by these two. Father's Day is not the same as Christmas. They're both non-Islamic. But one of them pushes certain values, the other one does not push those same values. Sometimes some of them push maybe even values you can say they're positive values. Others of them push values that are somewhat problematic at times. So the first element I always have to look at, what type of values is this custom pushing in my household? Because sure, it may not impact me immediately. Going back to the analogy of the burger, yes? But over 10, 15 years, it can impact my household. I have to be very thoughtful about this. See, brothers and sisters, you see, like I mentioned at the beginning, people who are secular, they don't care about what's happening on the other side of the world. Part of it comes from this. When you lose this sense of Islamic culture in your household, then you say, listen, I'm American. What does it have to do with me on the other side, what they're doing? That's their business. On the other side of the world, whatever happens. It's a lack of Islamic culture. And sometimes you'll hear this from Muslims, by the way. So element number one, I have to be thoughtful in terms of what type of values is this particular custom going to push in my household. We are surrounded by the wrong values, and our households are being bombarded with these wrong values. Sometimes indirectly and sometimes directly. They will not show its impact immediately. And that is why you and I sit here in a naive sense. We say, it's not a problem. My children's growing up with these values. It's not a big deal. No, down the road it will show itself. It's not something that shows itself immediately. It's something that will show itself 10 years from now, 15 years from now. I have to be very thoughtful. This custom, what is it pushing? What values is it promoting? Halloween, what type of values is it promoting? Someone might even come and say, it's not necessarily haram. We already discussed this. We're not saying it's necessarily haram. But what values is it pushing? This is element number one. I'll give you a quick example and then I'll move on to elements number two, yes? Just so we understand this idea of values. I read a book once from my child, from my son. He's 5 years old. I picked up a book on cars, right? Because you can't get safer than cars, right? So there's many stories in the book, and you open the book and some different stories about cars, right? It's Lightning McQueen, if some of you guys know, yes? So you're very well. So I opened the story of the book, okay. So it's a race between a male car and a female car. Now, you know, today we can't even figure out male and female when it comes to human beings. But somehow they figured it out when it came to the cars, right? So there's a male car and a female car. Okay, so it's a simple story. You're reading it for a 5-year-old, but look at the values it promotes. So the female car is supposed to come. The female car is not as strong, capable, qualified as the male car. So what does she do? She comes into the racetrack and she begins to flaunt her beauty. She begins to pose. And all the spotlights begin to zoom on her. Everyone's taking pictures of her. And she is posing. And the male car is so mesmerized by the beauty that is being flaunted that his tongue is just sticking out of his mouth. And he completely forgets about the race. And then she slowly makes her way to the end of the race. So it seems like a very innocent idea. But what values is this pushing for my child? Now, if I write a letter to Ayatul Sistani, can I read this book? Is it halal or is it haram? He may not necessarily say it's haram. You understand the point? But is this the value I want my child to grow up with? Do I want to teach my daughter that, yeah, you're supposed to flaunt your beauty in society? Or does Islam teach the exact opposite of that? So element number one, I always have to look at what values are being pushed, yes? Take this principle and apply it to other things. Holidays are the same things. Gatherings that we have within the culture that we live in. We live in Western culture. There's no running away from this, yes? But we have to be thoughtful about how we engage it. And by the way, I'll say this very briefly before I move on. Other minorities and other faiths, they are already very thoughtful about how they engage with these. It's only Muslims, typically, who are very behind on this issue. Other faiths come, they say, listen, this doesn't agree with my faith. I'm going to engage with it in a very minimal way. It's only Muslims who just completely open up themselves to this culture. So element number one, what type of values is it pushing? Element number two, even if it's not haram, even if it's not pushing the wrong values. So Islam says I can engage with it to a certain extent. But what we understand from the Ahl Bayt is that non-Islamic culture, even if it's not bad culture, neutral culture, should never be the primary culture in my household. It should always be the secondary culture in my household. What do I mean by that? There are cultural elements that the Prophet brought for us, that the Ahl Bayt brought for us. Those are supposed to be the highlighted culture in your household. On a secondary level, sure, non-Islamic culture with these boundaries that we mentioned, I can engage in as well. But that should never become the primary. That should always be secondary. The customs and the practices that are highlighted in my household have to be Islamic. Doesn't mean you don't engage with other cultures. Trust me, our children will engage with other cultures all the time. If they have a phone, they're already engaging with other cultures. But you have to make sure the primary culture in the household is what? Has elements of Islamic culture. What are some of these elements that the Prophet brought for us? I will go through a quick list for you. Aloud salawat, please. Of those elements that strengthens Islamic culture in the household is what? Is when the time of prayer comes, praying on time, ideally praying together. The Prophet emphasized this. This was supposed to be part of my lifestyle. Some households you go to, the alarm clock goes off. It's not even a thing in the house. So people come, they go 20 minutes later, 40 minutes later, 2 hours later. The father sometimes, the mother sometimes, she doesn't care. It's not an emergency, by the way. It's not like they're busy with something else that they can't drop in those moments. Sometimes that happens, yes? No, it's not even part of the culture in the household. Well, that's a red flag. That's very worrisome. If my child doesn't connect primarily with Islamic culture, he will begin to connect with secular culture. And secular culture, not every element of it is evil, by the way. No, it's neutral, but it's not Islamic. Praying needs to be a thing in the household. Number two, the recitation of Quran needs to be a thing in my house. Many Muslim households, it's not a thing. Number three, the dhikr and adhkar that we have. I come and sit in the car. There's a dua for that when I'm about to start with my car. We're going to go on a trip. There's a dua for that, yes? I reach home. There's a dhikr for that. All of these things, the Ahl Bayt didn't teach us these things to say every single one of them you have to do. But they said it so that it becomes part of our culture, so the concept is present in my lifestyle. See, a child that grows up in this household, very different from a child that grows up in a household that doesn't have these elements. Number four, moving on, these a'yad and celebrations that we have, this is also part of our Islamic culture. Number five, dress code. Dress code is part of Islamic culture. There are studies done on children raised in families where the mother decides to actively take on Islamic dress code. There's studies done on this. And the effect that it has on the confidence of the child in practicing his or her faith. It's a big deal. Of those elements, living luxurious lives and extravagant lives. This is not part of Islamic culture. It's not necessarily haram all the time. But Islam didn't push this idea. Islam said, you live a modest life, you live a comfortable life. This is something I want to pass on to my children. This is something I want it to be part of my Islamic culture. The manners that Islam taught us, manners. This was supposed to become part of my Islamic culture. And there is a list that can continue, and you can add to this list as well. But I can never allow non-Islamic culture to become primary. If that happens, then you see it in that household. Where do you see it? I'll give you some examples. Now this person is working his 9 to 5. Now Islam tells him, oh, you have to go for Hajj. You have to drop everything, you got to go Hajj. So what do you mean Hajj? I'm about to have my promotion, what do you mean Hajj? So that's not the culture he was raised with. So not raised with these ideas. He was raised with the idea his 9 to 5 is his only thing in this life. Now you tell him, oh, 6 o'clock in the morning, when everybody else is asleep, 5 o'clock in the morning, you have to wake up and pray Fajr. What are you talking about? My daughter is going to be raised with the idea she's supposed to flaunt her beauty. Now at the age of 9, 10, 12, whatever the case might be, yes? Now she's supposed to observe hijab from an Islamic perspective. Of course she's not going to be able to connect with this. This goes against her whole world. Because Islamic culture was not a thing in that household. There are people, they are being massacred on the other side of the world. And then this person doesn't care. Say, no, you're supposed to care about this. He's a believer, you're a believer. At the end of the day, he's a human being. Your religion teaches you to care about him. But if he's not raised with Islamic culture and he's just raised with secular culture, it's going to be far more difficult for him to connect. Now, of course, as we speak, things are so bad that even secular people now have begun to speak out, yes? But the reality is, if he doesn't have an Islamic connection to this, he's not going to understand. So you have to come, you have to speak out in your own capacity. What are you talking about? A child and a household that lacks these elements of Islamic culture, brothers and sisters, down the road it will show itself. And down the road it's too late to come and try to build these values and these ideas. Therefore, I as a Muslim, I have to hold on to my Islamic identity. And that means when I engage with Western customs and cultures, 2 elements I have to always keep in mind. Number 1, is it pushing the wrong values in my household? And number 2, is it becoming primary? Does my child connect more with Christmas than he does with Eid and the birth of the Prophet and Eid al-Ghadir and this and that? None of these are haram, but I'm building the wrong culture in my household. Yes, my child will know what Christmas is, but he should primarily connect with Islamic celebrations and holidays. It's a matter of primary and secondary. Yes? Otherwise, my child is not going to be brought up. Then down the road, I ask him to obey Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Well, he's not going to connect with that culture anyways. Yes? These are the things, brothers and sisters, that are threats for us in this part of the world. Of course, our brothers and sisters in other parts of the world like Palestine and Lebanon today, we are all aware of the massacre that is taking place, the bombings that take place, and we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, truly it feels like, and I mentioned this at the beginning of today's course as well, it truly feels like you are closer to the time of Dhuhr now. Truly feels like the evil are becoming more evil. And those who are standing up for justice, it seems as though they are becoming more pure in their path as well. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that sooner rather than later He brings about the return of our beloved 12th Imam. بالنبي وآله رحم الله من قرأ سورة الفاتحة مع الصلوات على محمد وآل محمد اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين يا الله بسم الله.
Thank you, Jazakumullah Sheikh. Jazakumullah khair, Sheikh. Sister Zainab, if you can step forward for a moment, please. صلوا على محمد وآل محمد.
Assalamu alaikum, everyone. I wanted to tell you about a project that many members of our community have been working on since Safar to bring awareness to the general public, the Sunni community, the pro-Palestinian community about the message of Imam Hussein, sort of bringing that connection to what is happening in Palestine. And we've A lot of people have worked hard to design a gallery. You can see it outside. It's our first time setting it up. You can have a water bottle. We have cards on there. Keep one of those. We've printed 1,000, so inshallah in October, during the protests and the vigils of any of the events happening, we will be setting up this display and talking about the message of Imam Hussein and making the connection to what's happening today in Palestine, and to sort of explain that concept. I've written a short poem, and hopefully that might help sort of make that connection as well. It's called Karbala is Now. Karbala was then and Karbala is now. Faith and Sumud are visible now. The battle has changed and the tyrant is new. The enemies still large and supporters still few. The burning tents and the screams are now. Truth is now and its echo is loud. The battle is now where warriors fall down. Ali Asghar's cry is heard in children now. The prisons are now and the journey is hard, but dignity abounds and humiliation is far. Now is the voice that calls from the hill. Is there anyone to help, is the question still. Now is the enemy who seeks to control. Now is the lesson the stories foretold. Now is the moment that we practiced for. Beat the palms on our chests, shouted, "Here I come, O Hussein. If only we had been there to take away your pain." There is no one like Hussein, there's no family so holy, but their lessons of justice are not solely one moment in history left to be trapped in stories. If we ever asked ourselves, what would I do? Would I stand up and be part of the 72? Or would I choose the path that was more secure? For Haqq, what am I willing to endure? The moment is now and the reckoning is clear. Allah is forever and His judgment is near. The fire is now and the rage is hot. The enemy is shameless and their hearts are wrought. Yaqeen is now and despair is not. Karbala